Do violent video games result in more aggressive children? An argument by Julie Joyce. I'm going to begin by talking about a few definitions that we'll be discussing, and they will come up a lot throughout this presentation. Violent media, according to the American Psychological Association, is defined as those that depict intentional attempts by individuals to inflict harm on others. An individual can be a non-human cartoon character, a real person, or anything in between. Aggression is a behavior intended to harm another individual who is motivated to avoid that harm. It is not an affect, emotion, or aggressive thought, plan, or wish. It excludes accidental acts that lead to harm, such as losing control of an auto or accidentally killing a pedestrian, but includes behaviors when intended to harm, even if the attempt fails. Violence refers to extreme forms of aggression, such as physical assault, assault, and murder. All violence is aggression, but not all aggression is violence. So I am in favor of video games causing more aggressive children. Not only did this article help me understand why I believe that way, but I have looked into this for a while because I found it interesting. I wrote a paper on it freshman year, and I personally think that violence can spur from many places, especially today. We're surrounded by it in the media, and there's no escaping children's exposure to violence. But violent video games are an avoidable negative exposure that they really don't need in their lives. I think it just causes them to act out more aggressively than they would had they not played these games. It actually allows them to take part in these violent killings instead of just seeing it on TV. Now, going off what I just said in regards to them actually being able to take part in these violent games, I personally think that exposure when you're young to any kind of influence, whether it be positive or negative, will have an effect on your future. When you're young, it can corrupt your mind into thinking that violence isn't as much of an issue as it is if you're constantly playing these violent video games. And also, although there are age restrictions that are ultimately trying to be enforced, kids will always find a way to do things that they're not allowed to do in every facet of their youth. But this is just another thing that they shouldn't be exposed to, but they are at a young age. Before I move into analyzing the article that I read when I chose to argue this topic, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other articles that I came over when I was doing my rough draft of this project. So I read an article on Psychology Today that discussed the Sandy Hook shooting and possible causes for why Adam chose to do what he did. Adam Lanza was an avid video game player, mainly violent video games, and many claim that that has nothing to do with the shooting, but this article explores another possibility. It talks about a meta-analysis that was conducted on violent video games' effects on behavior, which instead of taking small studies and using that to support their claim, they took a mass amount of data and looked for a trend. And the experiment randomly assigned participants to play a violent versus non-violent video game and then measured their aggression. They conducted this experiment with over about 135,000 people, and they concluded that they actually do increase aggression. It wasn't by a large number that this trend occurred, but it was a substantial amount to prove their point. Now, the article's point was that although taking away violent video games from the world isn't going to stop mass shootings, it will, over time, decrease aggression. I also read something else on the American Psychological Association. Okay, so according to the American Psychological Association, violent video games can increase children's aggression. I want to read a quote that I read in the article that I took this from. The number one negative effect is that they tend to inappropriately resolve anxiety by externalizing it. So when kids have anxiety, which they do, instead of soothing themselves, calming themselves, talking about it, expressing it to someone, or even expressing it emotionally by crying, they tend to externalize it. They can attack something, they can kick a wall, they can be mean to a dog or pet. Additionally, there is an increased frequency of violent responses from children who play these kinds of video games. In conclusion, kids see violence day in and day out in their video games, so they think it's okay to act out. Children act out on what they see on television and in violent games. Many times it's them using their imaginations because they're young, but we can't really tell whether they can distinguish the difference between reality and fantasy at a young age. Now I'm going to move in and talk a little bit about the article that I read on CNN that I summarized for my final. I'm going to start by summarizing the article, and then I will conclude with an analysis of the argument within the article. The article argues that violent video games cause children to be more aggressive. It is based on a study conducted by Dr. Craig A. Anderson of Iowa State University, and the study was over a span of 6 months. The study included 3 groups of kids, 181 students from ages 12 to 15, 1,050 Japanese students from ages 13 to 18, and 364 U.S. kids ages 9 to 12. The U.S. children were asked to list their 3 favorite games and how often they played them. In the younger Japanese groups, the researchers looked at how often they played 5 different violent video game genres, including fighting, action, shooting, adventure, and there was a few others. In the older group, they gauged the violence in the kids' favorite games and how much time they spent playing them each week. The Japanese children rated their own behavior and in terms of physical aggression, such as kicking, hitting, or getting into fights with other students. And the U.S. children rated themselves too, but the researchers took into account reports from their peers and studied. Children who were exposed to more video game violence did show more aggression over time than their peers who had little or no exposure. So moving into the analysis section, what is the issue in this argument? The issue is, do violent video games cause children to act more aggressively? What is relevant to this issue? The study to which it's based is very relevant to the issue because the entire study is in support of the fact that violent video games do increase aggression in children. The sources that they use to support their claim within this article, such as Dr. Raul Guzman, director of the Research Center for Group Dynamics, Dr. Craig A. Anderson, who conducted the study, and Dr. Cheryl K. Olson, who is a co-director of the Center of Mental Health and Media at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. These people all aid to the credibility of this argument. Also, the fact that they conducted this study in 2 different countries, 2 different countries means 2 different levels of violence within these 2 countries. It shows that they're trying to use different areas to conclude the same idea. Other aspects that could be relevant to this issue are the home situations of the children. Maybe some of their parents were fighting, or maybe they were going through a divorce. You never really know each individual child's home life, and as well as the parental supervision of these children. Some children may have a lot of parental supervision and their parents are a little bit more strict in a sense where they don't want them playing video games, whereas other children may be able to do whatever they want in regards to video game playing, so they play. Okay, now where does the burden of proof fall within this argument? The burden of proof lies on the side that is in support of violent video games increasing levels of aggression in children. I came to this conclusion because the article is set up to convince us that this claim is indeed true. Now I'm going to talk about some of the premises that lead to the conclusion of this article's argument. I'm probably well over my time at this point, so I'm going to try to not bore you with too many details. Okay, so the first premise. About 90% of US kids ages 8 to 16 play video games, and they spend about 13 hours a week doing so. More if you're a boy. So now a new study suggests that virtual violence in these games make kids more aggressive in real life. The inference here is that violent video games may be causing more violent behavior in children and young adults. The second premise in this article is that kids in both the US and Japan who reported playing lots of video games, violent video games, had more aggressive behavior months later than their peers who did not, according to the study that was conducted. This is implying that studies have shown violence in video games results in more aggressive behavior as opposed to those who do not participate in playing violent video games. The third premise is that in every group, children who were exposed to more violent video games did become more aggressive over time than their peers who had less exposure. Again, this is just inferring that children who were more violent were as a result of their exposure to these games within these studies. Now, this doesn't really take into account that there are other reasons why children become more aggressive, but within the study it shows that the aggression was increased in comparison to those who weren't playing the games. For the fourth premise, it states that these findings are pretty good evidence that violent video games do indeed cause aggression within children, or increased aggression, should I say. The statement was made by Dr. Roel Hoosman, the director of Research Center for Group Dynamics at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research in Ann Arbor. This is inferring that basically here they're using a credible source to support their argument. The fifth premise is a statement made by Hoosman again, and in which he says there are two ways violent media can spur people to violent actions. First is imitation. Children who watch violence in the media can internalize the message that the world is a hostile place and act aggressively and think it's okay to do so. He also says kids can become desensitized to violence. When you see it and you actually participate in it in these video games, you're going to think that it's not really as bad as it actually is to participate in violent behavior, violent and aggressive behavior. So on to the sixth and final premise. Dr. David Walsh, the president of the National Institute on Media and the Family, which is a Minneapolis-based nonprofit, argues that persuasiveness of violence in the media has led to a culture of disrespect in which children get the message that it's acceptable to treat one another rudely and even aggressively. It doesn't necessarily mean that because a kid plays a violent video game, they're immediately going to go out and beat somebody up. But the real impact is in shaping the norms and shaping attitudes. As they gradually shift, the differences start showing up in behavior. And I think that this is the best way to conclude my final project because I completely agree with this statement. I don't think that violent video games is going to cause people to act out so much more aggressively than they would had they not played the games. But it exposes them to things that they're going to be exposed to. I understand they're going to be exposed to violence in the media and on television and in action films when they're young, especially young boys, but it is just another thing that I personally don't think is right for kids to be playing these games where they're shooting characters, because slowly these norms will shape into a society of children that potentially could just be desensitized to the violence and not think that there really is as much of a big deal as it actually is. So the inference from premise 10 is that although violent video games may not have a quick and direct effect on children, it is shaping our society to be more accepting of these attitudes when we allow children to play them day in and day out. In conclusion, I am in support of this article, and I hope that I argued my point. I did it the best that I could. I enjoyed this class and this final project especially because instead of writing down our thoughts and having time to plan them, we actually had to be sure of our argument and support it that way, which I thought was really interesting. This entire class was a great learning experience, and I hope that you find my argument to be as strong as I think it is. Thank you for all of your help, and I look forward to the possibility of taking another class with you in the future. Thanks again.